Good morning also on my behalf. I'm Saara Haapasaari. I work as a sustainability specialist here at HEUNI. In recent years, we have increasingly collaborated with businesses and labor market organizations to tackle labor exploitation and increase the awareness of the private sector about the risks that we have also here in Finland and in Europe. This year, the EU has also presented the first proposal on corporate sustainability due diligence legislation, which makes respecting human rights mandatory to some of the largest companies in the EU. I'm extremely excited to present our two next speakers and discuss with them about the role of business in protecting human rights and vulnerable workers and implementing due diligence. Here, live on stage, is Marja Innanen, the Executive Director of Global Compact Finland, which is a local network of UN's Global Corporate Responsibility Initiative. Marja has a wide experience from working with multiple sustainable development topics in the Finnish government and is now utilizing this expertise to develop the sustainability ambition of Finnish businesses further. And online, we're really happy to have Sandra Atler joining us from Sweden. Sandra is a director of the Human Rights and Business Practice Group and a senior advisor at Enact Sustainability Strategies. Sandra is an experienced human rights lawyer who has supported Professor John Ruggie and team while forming the UN Guiding Principles. And in Enact, Sandra has worked with multiple companies on improving their due diligence activities and strategies. Thank you both so much for joining us. So, we have just heard a great discussion on labor exploitation and the risks that are present in many companies, supply chains, and operations here in Finland and in Europe as well. According to your experience, how aware are companies of the risks, such as forced labor and labor exploitation, that are also present in the local operations and supply chains in Finland, Sweden, or Europe, in these so-called low-risk countries? Let's start with Marja.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and congratulations, HEUNI, for your great work. But for your question, I think that more and more companies, they are really becoming aware of the responsibilities, how to support and respect human rights. But I think that there is still a quite huge gap between the will and the real actions. Few years ago, it was conducted a study here in Finland how companies fulfill their human rights responsibilities, and this study showed that although the companies, they are generally on general level, they are quite well committed to respecting human rights, they are still in very or quite early stage in integrating human rights responsibility in their core actions and activities. And I remember that there was a figure 25%, so only 25% of Finnish large companies have human rights due diligence processes in place. But my personal feeling is that somehow companies may pay more attention to their supply chains and actions there than their local operations. As we have heard, we still have major issues here also in Finland. And companies also publish quite little about their actions, how they respect human rights, but generally I think that the status of Finnish companies is generally in the same level than we have than global business has. Also, some years ago, there was a study where we studied 230 world's biggest companies, and almost half of these world's biggest companies were unable to give any proofs how they respect human rights. We Global Compact, we have 16,000 or almost 17,000 participants, 17,000 companies, and 90% these says that they have human rights policies in place, but only around 20% conduct human rights impact assessments. So this means that only a few companies have really identified the human rights risks and other possible risks.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sandra, what is your view on the how companies here in Finland or in Sweden are aware of the forced labor risks that we have?
Thank you so much for also inviting me as a speaker, and also congratulations, as Marja said, to this very important event. I think I agree with almost everything that Marja said. I think that this is an area where the policy commitment generally is there. Almost all websites you find the right reference to zero tolerance for forced labor, etc., etc. But then in practice, I think that the knowledge and the ability to react and respond is extremely low. So I would say generally that there are some individuals usually in the organization that are aware, but most individuals are not. And some individuals in the organization are able to respond and know what to do, but for that person to get the leverage internally to actually enable the right response, something quite a big step. I have to ask, I see everyone is frozen on the picture. Can you see me or hear me?
Yes. Yes, very well. We can see and hear you.
Good. Then it's just you that are frozen for me. Okay, sorry. So I think that the problem is the problem I think is also psychological a little bit. So I think that if you talk about the topic, people are aware of it in the sector. They understand that it's a problem for everyone else apart from themselves. So I think that's not just about not being willing, but I think it's also psychological. They think that we have a policy, we have good ways of working, so that they fail to see how the company might be contributing by maybe poor purchasing practices, pushing low costs, etc. If a case is highlighted in media or by an NGO, it's often investigated with great urgency and almost panic-like situation. Sometimes we get in touch from clients, wanting to do the right thing at that point. But then after that's done, the kind of interest for it declines. So I think that there's a big problem really in getting companies to really own the issue, whatever the reason is. I think that's part of the biggest problem. And generally also, I was listening to the previous session and what you were saying about empowerment and the need to know your rights. I mean, that's also super crucial, but we also have to recognize, right, that the power imbalance is enormous between the company and the individual who is vulnerable. So even if they know, and this is also what our impact assessment demonstrates, even if they know very well their rights, from knowing your rights to actually being able to enforce them, it's not so much about informing people about they have the right, it's about enabling, right? So the unions, the unions have an enormous role to play. In some places, of course, they don't have membership because it's illegal work, but we need someone to speak on their behalf. I think that's part of a really big problem. And then maybe my last point would be that, and it's a surprisingly poor knowledge, even those people who know about the problem inside the company, that it's a problem globally. It's a surprisingly poor knowledge about how this is actually also a challenge at home. So I think that's one of the remarkable issues. I think that generally, you kind of tend to think that, maybe somewhere else, maybe in Italy or Spain, where they have lots of migrants. But the fact that also here we have a lot of migrants who are walking our streets with no work and no home, they need to do some form of work. Where do they end up? The connection between that canteen, restaurants, cleaning, etc., the high risk kind of sectors is extremely low. So I think there's a lot of need for kind of enhanced awareness and action in that space as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandra. On to the next question. We do have the principles and frameworks on how to implement corporate responsibility for human rights, and the UN guiding principles are over a decade old. Why is it still so difficult to make companies really act? And how are the companies best motivated to implement their respect for human rights and due diligence? Marja, what do you think?
Thank you. This is a tricky question. Well, I think that there has been quite good progress during the past decades, and more companies are really become aware of these UN guiding principles. But if I may refer again our research, it reveals that that the Global Compact participating companies, over 70%, they are really committed to implement these UN guiding principles, but almost 40% says that they have very severe difficulties to implement UNGPs through the supply chains. So especially long supply chains are challenge. Also, lack of guidance, lack of practical knowledge is one thing which somehow prohibits using these UN guiding principles. And actually, what we have now done to motivate companies to use and implement the UN guiding principles is that we are now starting a program, Business and Human Rights program, where we really want to guide companies to use this and motivate to use this, and then companies can enact an ongoing human rights due diligence process and really set concrete targets to address the salient human rights issues. And of course, one big motivational aspect is definitely the EU legislation and reporting requirements, which I think that UN guiding principles are in a core there. But I think that only voluntary measures are not enough, because UN guiding principles are at the present they are voluntary, but it's not enough. That's why we are welcoming also this legislation and other measures which would support using the UNGPs.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts on this, Sandra?
Well, I think that first of all, I think that it's important to recognize that it's not intuitive for companies to manage human rights. They are not companies are not designed or experts on human rights. They are intuitive to respond to the company risk related to brand, investors, legal risks, etc. That's why also one of the main challenges is that companies, when human rights issues occur, they treat them as company risks, and then you get the response wrong. So I think that's really core, because also awareness is not enough, it's action. So we've had the past decade of the guiding principles in place, and even though awareness is great, etc., but it's really about the proof in the pudding. So companies have a responsibility to go from awareness to action. So yes, it's good. I agree with Marja that it's good that awareness has been increasing and policy commitments, etc. But it's only as good as it is on the ground, right? So I think it's really few companies, if not zero, that actually get it right all the way down. So I think that's the price until we have it done is carried by those individuals who are suffering and not receiving appropriate treatments, but also not remediation for the harm that they are suffering. Lacking practical knowledge is one part, but it's also that companies are not looking actively for the information that they need. So I think we've given kind of a decade of arguments for why companies haven't been able to succeed. But the fact is that the companies decided that they wanted to do this. They would find information. They would get the information. They would get the systems. So I think that it's just that the building systems, the governance, the holding accountable internally. That's all the stuff that the UNGPs require, the reporting guiding, the reporting CSRD, the CSDDD that's upcoming, all of those things, it's the systematic approach that's needed, and that's not very sexy. It's not the interesting thing that you can, that companies are interested in talking about when they get into media or something like this. So I think it's the only way to create that motivation, and I'm sorry to say, but I think that is regulation, because it hasn't been able to be created so far, and I think therefore that good regulation is probably the only way to go.
Thank you so much. This leads to the next question, and I also think the last question. Is sustainability enough? We know that our planetary boundaries are tightening, and we should challenge the idea that our economies must grow continuously. At the same time, we consumers enjoy cheap prices of products that may have been produced with forced or child labor, and in many countries, the workers don't get a living wage. Marja, how should the fundamentals of profit-making change, and how can we make the companies do so we would actually contribute to sustainable development regarding the planet and the people as well?
Again, very difficult question. But I've been following this theme for a long year. I was working for the National Committee of Sustainable Development over 10 years, and seen the development and the curve, sort of. After the Rio process, the ecological, sustainable, and societal sustainability, they were seen as equal goals. And in 2010s, the economy was seen sort of as a tool or mean to solve the ecological crisis. And then there was an idea that the economy is sustainable if it functions in the Earth carrying capacity and produces well-being for people. And this is the thinking behind of for example, our national strategy, sustainability strategy. And now, when we have come to 2020s, this economic thinking has been again challenged, because the fact that we have really exceeded the nature's limits, carrying capacity, and there's growing inequality all over the world, which threatens stability of society. And we have also lost resources of our ecological and social capital. And now that leads us to new kind of thinking, that economy and business should not only be seen as a mean to produce well-being, but also they should be seen as a repairing and renewing mechanisms, how economy can renew and repair ecological and social capital. This is the idea which I have noticed, which is now coming more and more through the, for example, how companies think. And now we have learned and heard from the world's leading companies that they want to really put back more into society, into environment and nature, and also economy, than they take out. So these companies are called net positive, and it's a new way of thinking and doing business. And these net positive companies, they thrive solving world's problems and not creating them. In Global Compact family, we really think that business can be force for good, and I think that this idea or ideology also gives us hope, sort of.
Great, thank you. And Sandra, do you think the way we do business will change? And how willing are companies to do that?
Well, it all depends on the motivations, right? So I think at this moment in time, if we can create the drivers for it to happen, I mean, I think it's likely companies, typically speaking, are more excited about doing good than perhaps to prevent harm. So I think if there is a way that you can merge and inspire that, I think that's of course great. But it's also important in this context to consider the need to ensure that we are not offsetting. So the primary responsibility is to do no harm, and we have to focus on that first. We have to ensure that we prevent and address and mitigate and remedy all the risks and impacts that we are creating and contributing to before we go off on some exciting project to build a new village or advance roads and child vocational training or something like this, because otherwise it's going to end up kind of wrong. So just cautioning that the term net positivity doesn't kind of equate like, okay, we do 70 bad over here and we do 30 good there, so we're net plus. That we really consider that due diligence and addressing harm comes first. And then of course it's great if you want to go beyond and make sure that your business model also contributes to good. But for example, if child labor, for example, is core to your problem in your supply chain, you can also combine these, right? So you make sure you address the risks, but then you also contribute to child protection and child welfare in that same context. I think that's one way of thinking about how you can also contribute to more than just wanting to kind of meet baseline due diligence.
Excellent. Thank you so much both for sharing your expertise and your insights and taking the time to join us. This has been a great glimpse on what the private sector is doing currently regarding sustainability and respect of human rights. Now I'll give the floor back to Natalia.